You ever meet a Palestinian and ask where they're from, and they hit you with, well, it's complicated? Yeah, that's because we've been scattered across the world like hummus at a potluck. Several months ago, over on my friend's channel, The Mysterious Middle East, he spoke about how a Moroccan folklore connected to a terrifying entity known as the La Diablesse could have been exported to the Caribbean by the Portuguese via the UAE and Oman during their 16th century colonial expansion that stretched from the Middle East to the Americas. And it got me thinking, what about later Middle Eastern exports to the region of a more grounded nature, specifically concerning the Palestinian diaspora? Well, it turns out there's a whole history that's rarely spoken about. While most people know about Palestinians in the Middle East, the US, or even Chile, there's a whole Caribbean story that never gets told. But yeah, that's right, my fellow falafel enthusiasts. There are Palestinians in Venezuela and in its Caribbean neighbors of Trinidad, Jamaica, and even Haiti. And like everything involving Palestine, their migration story is full of struggle, adaptation, and just a little bit of that Middle Eastern hustle. So today, let's talk about how the Palestinians ended up in the Caribbean, how they fit into island life, and whether they too are out there whining to soca at Carnival. Firstly, did you know that many early Arab immigrants from the Levant who ended up in the Americas, including Palestinians, were collectively labeled as Turcos because they held Ottoman passports, making it difficult to distinguish specific national origins? This, you will see, plays a bigger role in the 21st century when it comes to distinguishing Palestinian identity from the larger Arab Caribbean identity. So, first things first. Why do Palestinians seem to be everywhere except Palestine? Short answer: colonialism. Long answer: displacement. Palestinians, like our cousin the Syrians and Lebanese, started migrating in the late 19th and early 20th centuries when the Ottoman Empire was crumbling. People left for economic opportunities, dodging Ottoman military conscription, or just because they heard life in the New World was better. Now, if you were lucky, you made it to Chile or Honduras, where Palestinian immigrants became business elites. But if you were like our Caribbean-bound cousins, you got off the boat in Trinidad, Venezuela, Jamaica, or Haiti, where life was, well, different. By the time British and French colonial rule controlled these islands, Palestinians were showing up as merchants, traders, and small business owners. And after the Nakba in 1948, when Israel was created and 750,000 Palestinians were forced into exile, more of our people came looking for new homes. The Caribbean wasn't exactly the first stop for most Palestinians. It was more like a layover. Many originally went to Honduras, El Salvador, or Colombia, but later, some families drifted into the islands, making the Caribbean their new home. In Trinidad, Palestinians ended up in the same category as the Syrians and Lebanese, just called Syrians by the locals. Palestinian identity? Who needs that when you've got a generic Arab label? But before we continue, a mild disclaimer. This episode is from my perspective as a Palestinian American who currently lives in the Middle East, as an outsider looking in. Palestinian Trinidadians, on the other hand, may disagree with my observations. Anyway, let's go on. Early Palestinian migrants were mostly Christian merchants, hustling in retail, textiles, and small businesses. Their grandkids, however, they're full-on Trini now. They listen to soca. They eat roti, doubles, and kalaloo right alongside the most Palestinian of Palestinian dishes. And kalaloo itself is just another name for malukhia. FYI, kalaloo has African roots, brought to the Caribbean by enslaved Africans. And because it is African, you can understand why it's popular in the Levant, because its Arab equivalent is huge in Egypt. And for those of you who had both the Egyptian and Trini versions of this meal, Tell me you can instantly tell the difference between the two, if you can. I bet you can't. They probably have an auntie who makes baklava with a side of callaloo. Oh, and don't even get me started on intermarriage. Palestinians mixed with Indo-Trinidadians, Afro-Trinidadians, and even Chinese Trinidadians, creating a whole new generation of Caribbean Arabs who are just as comfortable in a mass band at Carnival as they are at a family-owned fabric shop. Culturally, they've blended in so well that today, unless someone specifically tells you, you'd never know they were Palestinian. Meanwhile, over in Venezuela, Palestinians also arrived in waves, first as merchants, later as refugees. They mostly settled in Caracas and Maracaibo, where they became involved in commerce, trade, and textiles. Because let's be honest, a Palestinian without a business plan? Impossible. But Venezuela's Palestinian community stayed a little more politically active than their Trini counterparts. I mean, there's a reason Hugo Chavez was out here waving the Palestinian flag. The Arab Venezuelan community had influence. And while the Lebanese and Syrians were the bigger players, Palestinians had their own slice of the economic and political pie. Trinidad and Venezuela had the biggest Palestinian presence. But let's not forget the other islands where Palestinian families also left their mark. Jamaica. A small number of Palestinian and Syrian families settled in Kingston, mostly in retail and textiles. Over generations, they assimilated into Black and Indian communities, blending into the larger Arab Jamaican identity. In fact, one of the most famous Jamaicans of part Arab descent is perhaps one of the most famous Jamaicans in modern history, that being the legendary Bob Marley. Yes, even though he identified strongly with his African roots and Rastafarian beliefs, Bob Marley also had a part Syrian heritage through his father, Norval Marley. Norval was a white Jamaican of mixed English and Levantine descent. Some sources suggest that his family background included Syrian or possibly Jewish Syrian ancestry. So kudos to my Syrian cousins for birthing one of the 20th century's biggest icons. This takes us to Haiti and the Dominican Republic. Similar to Lebanon's presence, some Palestinians became part of the Arab business class, running textile and trade businesses in Port-au-Prince and Santo Domingo. Cuba and Puerto Rico. A handful of Palestinians ended up here, often through political exile or economic migration. Some left after Fidel Castro's revolution, while others stuck around, mixing into the local population. Now, with the risk of making sweeping statements that will not be reflective of everyone, so please don't get upset with me in the comments screaming it's not true. In most of these places, Palestinians didn't keep a separate ethnic identity for long. Unlike in Chile or El Salvador, where there is still a strong identity, in the Caribbean, they blended into the larger Syrian-Lebanese networks. And finally, the big question. Do Caribbean Palestinians still see themselves as Palestinian? Well, the answer is complicated and will obviously vary from family to family and person to person. What I can say is that most were absorbed into the larger Arab Caribbean communities, and over generations, their Palestinian identity faded. A lot of them just call themselves Syrian, Arab Trini, or Arab Venezuelan. But there are still some traces left, because one, you'll find Arab Caribbean families with Arab last names that are almost exclusive to the Levant. 2. Some Palestinian Trinidadians still have business connections back in the Middle East. 3. Every now and then, you'll hear a random Trini with Arab roots passionately defending Palestine in a rum shop. So, are there Palestinians in the Caribbean? Yes. But are they still fully Palestinian? That depends. Some have held on to their heritage, while others have become as Caribbean as a steel pan and a plate of palau. The reality is that Palestinians, like everywhere we go, adapted, blended in, and kept hustling. Whether in Venezuela, Trinidad, or Jamaica, they've carved out their own space, even if no one really talks about them. So next time someone says, "Wait, Palestinians are in the Caribbean?" you can hit them with a knowing nod and say, "Yeah, we out here. We just might be selling you roti and fabric at the same time."